Welcome back to Haven's Cafe. Grab a tea, grab a coffee, grab a scotch if you need one. Such are the times we live in. Today we're going to discuss what happens if the world has another major energy crisis, because that's what we seem to be on the way to. And indeed, in the last video, we were talking about how the Gulf countries are warning. Right today, Saudi Arabia, as the head of Aramco, which is Saudi Arabia's oil company, warned of the biggest oil shock in energy shock in history, warned of literal catastrophic consequences. Okay, last week, one of the Qatar's energy ministers said this will bring down the economies of the world. Okay, so it's important for us to talk about this because there's Trump on the other side, right, doing his usual circus of lies. Everything's going to be fine, mission accomplished, greatest victory in history, blah, 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 blah. And sadly, American media, both sides is all this, and a lot of Americans end up in like this haze, right? So what happens if there's this energy shock, right? Well, first of all, look, Trump isn't winning this war by a long way, all right? The decapitation strike didn't work. Iran didn't magically go away, okay? In fact, Trump has created an even more hardline situation, all right? Khamenei's son is now in power. Trump killed his wife and kid, all right? And whatever we think of, fanatics and fundamentalists, and I'm not on those guys' side. Right? I don't like those guys. Do I think that killing their wife and kids is okay? Absolutely not, right? So come on, let's just have some human decency here for a sec, right? So what happens if we face another oil shock? Now, the thing you have to understand is that the world is in a much more precarious place leading up to this position than it was before. If we had had a major energy shock in the 2010s, right, or even at the beginning of this decade, maybe the effects wouldn't have been so severe. They still would have been very, very severe, but now we are in a very different position. Okay, so what happens if there is a major energy shock? Well, the first thing that happens is that stock markets continue to crash, right? I mean, we've seen that for the last week, all right, because the price of energy goes up for all the stuff that gets produced. And that's what the stock market does, right? Everything from data centers to, I don't know, shoe factories, doesn't matter, right? But there's another effect. So that would have happened at any era in human history, right? And of course, the price people pay for energy rises, right? And that begins to come to why we're at such a vulnerable position. Because we're already in the teeth of this global quote unquote affordability crisis, right? Everywhere around the world, people feel that the cost of living has skyrocketed. It's become astronomical, right? Especially acute in various places. Americans are always complaining about this, but it's true across the world, right? So people are already pushed to the limit after a wave of inflation over the last 5 years, okay? And it's not just inflation. On the other side, their incomes have not been rising nearly as fast as they should, as they expected, as they hoped, okay? So if we have rising energy prices in a time when people are already stretched to the limit, you can understand the consequences, okay? The consequences are that people cannot afford to pay off their debts. Cars, credit cards, homes, whatever, okay? And that leads to waves of delinquencies. Delinquencies begin to lead to bank failures. And then we're back in a situation like 2008, a real financial crisis that's compounded by the fact that people's investments are in the stock market, okay? And as the stock market falls, the value of those investments falls, and they have even less with which to cover, right, possible bad credit, right, possible delinquencies. So all of that begins to add up to bank failures, okay? And then we're in deep in the woods. Because as banks fail, they begin to take financial lifelines down with them, all right? Economies begin to contract big time. Lending dries up, interest rates go up, blah, 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 the whole nine yards. Now, let's talk about interest rates. What does an energy shock do? Well, it creates a huge wave of inflation, okay? And how do we control inflation? Interest rates rise. Do you think in a situation like this, again, remember, we're more vulnerable than before. People already stretched the limit. Now imagine that interest rates spike, bang. And now they're paying, right? $300, $400, $500 more a month for whatever, right? $1,000 a month more, $2,000 a month more, a lot more. Mortgages, cars, credit cards, everything that is had on debt which is most things these days, right? Do you think they can afford that? No. So demand in the economy, a hole is blown through it as interest rates rise, okay? And that's when we get hardcore economic contractions, okay? But even that's just really the setup, guys. That's all kind of like minor league stuff. What else is happening out there these days? Well, governments are more indebted than ever. Countries are more indebted than ever, okay? Than they ever have been before. Now imagine that interest rates rise, spike because of that inflationary wave. Governments have to pay more in interest because they're more indebted than ever. What does that do? Well, it means that they have to cut various elements of the social contract, okay? Healthcare, childcare, this stuff is non-existent in America, but it does exist in the rest of the world, okay? In America, government cuts severe, right? Americans already don't have public goods. I mean things like schools, libraries closing, right? Whatever tattered remnants are left of the social contract in America begin to go away, all right? As the size of, what the government can invest in the economy begins to shrink, of course, bang, the economy begins to shrink too, right alongside it, okay? So these are different ways in which economies contract because of energy shocks. And I've tried to make this very analytical for you guys, right? So you understand it. Let me now shade in that picture. We are facing a catastrophic situation. Again, that's what Saudi's head of Saudi Aramco, right? Saudi Arabia's oil company, said today. And he's correct. That's what all the Gulf leaders and energy ministers have been saying. And they're correct. They understand these stakes, all right? They understand that we are a world pushed to the brink right now by a combination of factors, all right? We have incredibly high debt levels. We have stagnation already. People's incomes aren't keeping up. We have an affordability crisis. We have highly indebted people and governments, all right? All of these factors make us super, absolutely ultra vulnerable to an energy shock. It is the last thing that we want right now, all right? So I want you to understand the stakes, because if you don't understand the stakes, you will not be able to navigate your way through this crisis. If you understand, I'm saying that to you because this is the level of macro risk that we face. Markets are not pricing it well at the moment. Stock markets is just kind of hanging in there, right? And they're afraid to kind of admit this to themselves. They're afraid to think this through for themselves. But this is the risk. And in a situation of risk like this, we want to be very careful and very, very safe with the decisions we take and the investments that we make. Does that make sense? If this all continues to play out in the catastrophic way it has, in the reckless and stupid way that Trump has, unleashed it, then we are going to face a huge energy crisis. And, mark my words and mark the words of the Gulf energy ministers and whatnot, leaders, it could be bigger than the 70s. Don't want that. The 70s energy crisis caused a lost decade. We cannot afford a lost decade at this moment in human history. We have big problems to solve. Global democratic decline, we have climate change, yes, which is linked to this, okay? We have societies coming undone, we have social contracts unraveling, okay? We have mega scale civilizational challenges. We cannot afford a lost decade right now. Trump, in his madness and his hubris and his narcissism, doesn't care if we have one. In fact, there's a sadistic part of him that revels in all this, okay? The rest of us should be smarter than that. Does that make sense? All right, I hope that helped. Comments and questions below. Thank you for listening. This episode of Havens Cafe.